All right. Hey guys. Welcome back to the stream. I'm going to be working into this piece this week, which was basically a continuation of the 3D that we had. Whoops, thought I had that up there. The 3D we had last week, but I basically just went through and, to save time, rendered this out. So not really going to change much. There's a couple of things that are different from last week. The waterfalls have had a little bit of a tweak and the positioning's changed a bit. And put some simple texture on the rock. There's nothing too crazy. It's just kind of like things that I've just gone in and painted by hand in Photoshop just to make a really simple tiling texture. And then just projected that onto these rocks, which are really quite simple. So I can't exactly remember precisely where we got up to on the stream last week, because I just kind of fiddled with this a little bit afterwards. But yeah, nothing too crazy has happened. It's basically just been a little bit of tweaking here and there. But yeah, we're just going to basically work into this as a painting today in Photoshop. You know, working towards trying to basically, you know, work into this original sketch that we had here. So you can see obviously there are a few little tiny changes. Obviously these things don't ever come out exactly like the thumbnail. I've made a few tweaks here and there just to help the composition along. Yeah, kind of working into that. So we'll have to sketch out some bats to get them in there, start painting over the 3D stuff to get it looking not so 3D, and kind of giving it a nice little painterly feel, really. The first job, which is really boring, is actually just to go through. I probably should have done this before the stream as well. Just go through and kind of separate this render out into its different parts, kind of foreground, midground, background. And I've got this, what you call a clown pass out of Blender, which basically just gives you, you know, these really simple colored sections that makes it much easier to cut stuff out. You don't have to go through and actually do these things manually. You can just kind of use the selection tool to grab this stuff, and it's usually pretty good. There's always a few little spots where the colors in the clown pass will be the same or something like that, but again, for a painting like this, it's really not a big deal. You can just go through and do a little bit of manual fixing. Obviously all of these little architectural details here internally are not going to be automatically cut out, but again, we can just go through and tweak that. So depending on how complex the painting is, sometimes this process takes a while, sometimes it doesn't take very long at all. So this week it's a pretty quick job. Oops. So yeah, not particularly interesting to watch, so I'll try and just get through this pretty quickly. And these kind of render passes are really easy to push out of Blender. They used to be a little bit more difficult. There wasn't really a proper way to do it. You had to kind of fake it. But now that the Workbench rendering engine has been in Blender for a while, ever since they brought that in, that basically fixes that problem. So no longer an issue, which is nice. And yeah, depending on the kind of painting, like, you can spend heaps of time doing this, but you know, because it does make your life easier down the road if you've got well-organized layers. And I usually just duplicate areas of the painting, so I still have everything in the background, but if you kind of duplicate things on top of each other in the right order, then it kind of works out. So there's not, apart from getting the buildings away from the foreground, there's not a huge amount that really needs to be done. Maybe just bringing that waterfall on the left in front and the rock formation that falls behind there. I made a little bit of a tweak to the composition in the fact that there was meant to be a cave back here, and there still actually is a cave in here in the geometry, but I don't think I'm going to paint it as such. I'm going to leave that a little bit less defined. I added a little bridge up the top here, which I may or may not leave in. I thought it was a nice little idea, but yeah, we'll see how that goes. And then just grabbing the sky from here. This is probably the only thing that I won't duplicate out. I'll just delete it because we're basically going to replace everything in the sky anyway. So I'll just invert that selection and copy that out, and then we can just hide that back layer. There's also there's a bunch of fireflies around this render, which are these little dots here, which are just basically coming from the noise in the render. It doesn't quite get fully denoised when you run a denoiser on it, so there's a few little fireflies there. These ones are not particularly bad. They're, you know, super easy. I could either just paint them out, or you could go around in Photoshop with this and just go around with the spot healing tool, and that would make very quick work of them, because the background here is pretty simple. So this is probably overkill to actually do it manually now, but you know, it's one of those techniques that if you don't know that Photoshop has this spot removal tool, which is obviously for photography more than anything else, you might think it's a harder job than it is, but it's actually super easy. I think that's actually just a hole in the geometry, but I'm going to fill that in anyway. And I hand painted the rock texture because of the fact that I wanted to get a bit of a interesting look to it. So I'm hoping to not have to do a huge amount over the top of it. I want to add a little bit of extra texture in there, and obviously just do some more kind of painterly things in it, but it was, I guess, like a conscious decision as opposed to using a photographic texture on that, or a PBR texture. But both approaches work. I've done plenty of stylized paintings where I have started with a photographic texture, and then you kind of paint detail out of it. It changes depending on what the job is. And for this particular one, I just decided to hand paint this. I had a base that I already had used in a different painting, so that also made that decision a little bit easier, because I could just go and copy it in and tweak a few things in Blender to get that to work. But it's yeah, it's really not a particularly complicated thing to do. So yeah, we've got our three kind of layers here, the background, and we've got the waterfall and the foreground there. So it's really quite simple. In terms of that, the first thing I'm going to do is actually bring in a little bit of a curves adjustment into the background here, just to darken some of the areas down. And I do these adjustments as like an overall thing, and then I'm just going to mask out areas of that adjustment that I don't actually want. Brush settings are all okay. So yeah, just to kind of like direct the light around a little bit more, to really kind of figure out. I might just actually do that with just a straight out levels adjustment on the front here. So I want to darken the front down here, and I couldn't really find a great way to do that in Blender realistically with the lighting without really screwing around with things too much. So I just left it for now. But you can kind of see that this sketch as a whole is relatively dark. So I'm trying to like replicate that a little bit, I guess, that sense of light and that sense of kind of moodiness in it. Might not go quite as dark, but see where we get to, and we'll just kind of add in a little bit of sky, because I want to have some skylight kind of blooming across the top here. But I think the first real thing we're going to tackle today is actually sketching the bats and getting those in there, so a little bit more drawing as opposed to painting. And there's a bunch of tricks that we can use potentially for the painting to just kind of speed things up get everything going. Obviously the water in here doesn't really look like water, it looks like weird 3D shiny ribbons, which is exactly what it is. So we'll have to do a fair bit of work on that to get that where it needs to go. Just copying this adjustment layer down onto everything. We'll leave it off the last one, and then just flattening that down. You can work non-destructively on paintings like this, but I honestly tend not to. I tend to just paint over the top of stuff because I am lazy. And yeah, sometimes when you're working on a production piece or something like that, you do want to leave yourself a little bit of, that is way too purple. You want to leave yourself a little bit of non-destructive workflow because of the fact that, you know, someone might ask you to change something later and you don't want to have to go through and, you know, work super hard at something that you could have quite easily avoided if you were smart about it. But for this particular piece, I think will be all right. And again, just a few more adjustment layers in here, and just using masks to bring the effect of those adjustment layers into areas that I want it. And this is where we're really kind of getting into the stuff that you can't, well, you can, I shouldn't say you can't do it, but you can't do this stuff quickly and easily in Blender. You know, if you want to have this really localized lighting and vignettes and all that kind of stuff, it's of course doable, but it's about remembering what the overall goal is here, and it's to have a painting at the end of the day, right? So we want to have a JPEG essentially here, so whatever works to get that done is the correct process. There's never an absolutely correct process, I don't think, for anything. It's essentially whatever gets the job done at the time. So in this particular case, it's painting. And I think for people who are learning, you know, all of these skills, if you're a student kind of getting into entertainment art, like that's probably one of the biggest traps that you see with students getting into, you know, especially learning new software and learning new skills and stuff. You know, of course, the bigger your toolkit is, the better, I guess. But you also have to remember that, like, you're applying these skills to a job, and so the thing you want out of them is the thing that gets you, you know, gets you the work, gets you the result that you want. So there's a bunch of stuff that 3D is very good at doing that is not necessarily super applicable to a concept artist. It's, you know, it's like you got these clouds that I'm putting in here. It's like, yes, you could learn how to do volumetric simulations and all that kind of stuff, but if you're just trying to make a painting, it's probably, there's a balance there of figuring out what is useful and what is not. All right, I know I said I was going to draw those bats, but now I'm getting carried away painting. So I'm just gonna, I haven't really decided what I want the water to look like, which I probably should have, but whatever. So I might just play around with this initial waterfall in the foreground just for a little bit, just for like 5 or 10 minutes, just paint over some stuff in here and see what works, see what doesn't. And then we'll get onto the bats. But I want to keep this fairly graphic, the style of this whole piece. I want to break up areas where I can, and, you know, kind of smudge some things where I can, and keep it painterly. But my preference with any painting really is to really kind of lean on graphical shapes and make sure that read is really nice. I'm not someone who's going to get too carried away with like super photographic, realistic types of things. It's not, time and a place, of course, but it's not my preference. of course, for anyone watching, like if you want to ask questions about the process that I'm doing here, if you see me do something that you don't understand, feel free to just drop in the comments a question, or if you want to ask me questions about anything else art related, that stuff's always fun to talk about as well. So and I'll often come back to these clown layers because they're just super easy to use for just making selections and erasing things. But yeah, let's make a new little layer over the top here and start doing a little bit of sketching for the bats that are going to go in here. And I'll probably actually grab the really rough silhouettes of the rough silhouettes of the bats from the sketch, because I quite like the shapes that we've got there, so I think we can use these as a base. And we can also use them as a really quick compositional tool as well, because I think I will probably move them around a little bit in the composition. Mostly because I've now got this waterfall in the foreground, which technically I think these bats, especially the rear bat, the smaller one up the top here, would be behind that in terms of its depth of the scene. So just want to make sure that it's not doing anything funny. So let's just put them in a group and just knock them back a bit, and then we can start sketching over the top just to get the, you know, like a final, not a final drawing, but like some good base for our painting here. Because these bats are going to be nicely silhouetted. We can kind of switch this stuff hopefully pretty easily into the final painting. I made I think I was talking about this last week, looking for a solution to the design of these bats, which in this particular piece is not going to really be an issue because we're not going to be close enough to have to worry about it, I don't think. But yeah, looking for a solution in the design of these bats to deal with the legs, because I want these bats to have the ability to walk around on the ground a little bit more, which I think would require me to do a little bit of magicking with things like the size of the wings and stuff like that, because this one in particular has enormous wings. But yeah, just giving them the ability to walk around more like little dragons rather than bats, because bats are kind of a little bit ungainly, let's say. And the solution that I basically ended up going for was to just essentially make them like birds and give them little legs on the back. I tried a few other ideas that none of them really worked particularly well. So just realized that for whatever reason the title of this on Twitch is wrong, so I am not Alex Owen. I have changed it in the settings, but it obviously didn't take, so that's unfortunate. So I'm Ned, not Alex, so if you were expecting Alex or wondering why he sounded weird, that's why, because he's not here. His stream was yesterday, so if you were looking for him, you unfortunately missed it. So whoops, I don't know if I can change that later, hopefully I can, but these things happen, I guess. Alright, so this closer bat here is going to be a little bit more of a drawing. It's going to need a little bit, might need a couple of passes. So I'm just going to find like the basic kind of volumes there, so kind of a, a sphere for the head, and then I guess essentially it's a smaller sphere for the snout, and then just kind of bringing that to a point, kind of like an ice cream cone. And we're below looking up, so just kind of taking care to figure that out. Just get a big kind of sweeping curve in there for the underside of the body, and that all of that there, and then we can kind of, I like to, anytime it's handy, but especially for shots like this where the perspective's a little bit crazy, just find like the center line visually, which is going to be quite close to the outer edge of the body anyway, because that just allows you to kind of set that stuff, set where everything is, and then you can kind of work out the rest from there. So kind of top of the shoulders there, back hips, taking a few liberties obviously with the anemone on this one because of the fact that I'm shifting the legs around, and then the wings, just kind of, because the membrane of the wings on a bat kind of does join at the top of the shoulder, even though the arm does actually go into the center of the wing. So I can just find like a nice kind of angle for that. There's going to be some funky foreshortening on the other side. Again, I'm extending the wings a little bit here, and then I'm just bringing the wings back to connect kind of like above the legs. Normally the wings would actually connect somewhat down near like pretty close to the bottom of the feet. Actually on a bat, it's kind of weird. And the shoulders are going to kind of sit here, and then the arm kind of connects out to here until you get basically the intersection up there on the wing of where the fingers start, right? So the base of the palm. Then on the other side, there is, like I said, some foreshortening going on. So somewhere like that, pretty close, I think. Move the head sticking out a little bit too far here, the head. Just move that back down because of the foreshortening mostly. And then we will have, like, we've got a rider here. I imagine their arms kind of coming onto the back of the head here. They're not going to be a huge, more of a little silhouette in this shot, so I'm not going to put a huge amount of detail into the drawing here, just figuring out basically where they are. Just finding the arms, because that's going to hit the main part of the silhouette. I'll just kind of leave the rest up to the paint. That. I'm just going to put a white layer behind this and just use it as a little bit of a mask there so I can see slightly clearer what I'm doing in the drawing. Oops. I want to find I guess like the legs normally would they would kind of just go straight back behind as it's flying, but I think there could be like a more interesting shape to be found there, perhaps. Makes him look a little bit goofy, but I want him to look a little bit goofy, so that's alright. But I think, yeah, there's, you know, it's a little bit more of an interesting shape. Also frees up some area to give this guy, I don't know what I want to do with the tails. I guess like bats have got tiny little weird snumpy tails, I guess, so maybe that works. I don't want to give them nice little like mane or scruff down the front there, but it's mostly about the silhouette here, more so than anything else. And I think actually probably this line work is probably okay. Jaw's gonna come from just behind the eye there, just at the bottom of the ear, between the eye and the ear. I've got like, I want to give them kind of silly little noses too, so that's something that I might play up in the silhouette of this guy. Checking that, and then I'm actually not too unhappy with that as a drawing pass on that, so I might actually just throw a bit of value behind that. I'll just start with a purple from the painting, just to kind of block out the silhouette. That under there, and we'll make the line. We'll put the lines on a multiply layer. Just keeps everything nice and simple and nice and visible as we go through, and then we can really perfect the silhouette later on with the paint, because that is important. The drawing is obviously, I guess, the main controller of the silhouette. We can use the paint to edit it slightly, but ultimately it's all going to come together. And once we've got the main silhouette fleshed out, we can of course figure out how the light is going to affect everything, all the forms. I like to have a little bit of a silhouette to work from first. And yeah, I know, some people like to just paint this stuff straight out, and I guess like this. Sometimes I do that as well, but I'm much more, in general with my work, I'm much more comfortable drawing than I am painting. So I like to lean on the draftsmanship, I guess, a little bit more rather than the painting in the early stages, because it just makes sure I'm more likely to make a stupid mistake if I'm just trying to paint this stuff straight from nothing. obviously with like a relatively small area of the painting like this that the bat takes up, I will like end up just using the drawing as part of the painting layer. So some of the nice imperfections that you get on the edge of a drawing, where you might just have a little bit of the edge of a line or something like that just overhanging, or in the case of the bats, the tips of their wings being so small, you can just basically make the line part of the paint at that stage. Oops, it's the wrong layer. So if we turn that off, we can kind of, let's get rid of that sketch as well. We can kind of see where these bats are going to sit in the piece, and the value that I've put on them is not correct. It's just a arbitrary thing. We can start to, I think like this one in the foreground is going to be pretty dark. The one in the background actually is probably closer to what it needs to be, but it would probably need to have a little bit more blue in it as well, just because it's going to start to pick up the sky color and the atmosphere color, and the bat itself is kind of bluish, I guess. But now's the time that I'm also just going to bring in some there's a few ways you can do this. We can go like super heavy-handed with it and just bring in a few extra little color hits as well, bringing a bit more warmth into the body, especially around the mane here. So just a few reds and stuff like that, just to help it sit. And bringing a few little kind of like orange, although in this palette orange kind of does fade away to gray pretty quickly because it's a pretty blue palette. But yeah, just bringing a bit of variation in here with the wings. And I find that just helps to add a little bit of depth and interest later on. Like we might end up painting over 90% of that, but if that is there now, it can sometimes become useful in interesting ways later on. And then the lines themselves, especially just on this rear one, I'm just going to lighten them a bit as well, because they are not, do not need to be as dark back there, and that's all going to get painted in eventually anyway. And so just turning the lines off, even though that's super rough, that gives us an idea of like whether or not those values are sitting correctly as a base. And I think they're pretty close. The light is obviously coming from the top left of the image, so there won't be a huge amount of light hitting them. The one at the back though will probably be getting a decent amount. Hitting him in some regard. I've got some artistic license back there. But I think, I don't know, like I don't know if I want to bring it necessarily too much above the value of the rocks. But again, like we might, I think it would still kind of technically be a silhouette. So that's one of the, I guess, like the big decisions to make is do I want to push that value above the value of the rocks behind? I don't think I do. I think it works effectively enough without having to push the values kind of out of whack. And I think it would be nice to bring a little bit of the subsurface kind of scattering on the underside of the other wing, where the light, it's not necessarily hitting it directly, but I think, you know, you would get, it's a nice effect to have anyway, so I think we would get a little bit of that. Probably less, the one in the foreground would get less, because it's not being hit by direct light. There's a fair bit of light behind it, it's just not shining through directly, so I will definitely put a bit in there, because you've got this thin membrane of the wing. You can't not have a little bit of that scattering in there. It would definitely be there. And it's a nice way to also emphasize the shape of the arm that runs through the wing. But just be a little little bit more careful with it. And I'll probably throw a little bit of fog and stuff behind those bats as well, just to emphasize that. Just separate these lines out a bit. So we've got 2 layers instead of 1, then we can do, oops, that was duplicate. Separate that. Good, just knock the opacity back a bit. And in the other image, in the other painting I've done for this world, I've given the bats these like glowing blue eyes. The first one was, it was a night shot, so kind of made more sense. But I think I'm going to continue on with that as a theme, because it's a nice little hit for the image anyway. I think it works well in the design. And yeah, we'll probably have to, just because, I mean, the bat is really obviously quite dark, we want to hit a little bit of light from the bottom, I think, just to make that stand out a bit more against the rest of the image. So that's something we'll push in there in a sec. And we can also just start to clean up this silhouette a little bit now as well. And I'm going, let's merge these 2 layers together as well. So now we've just got one bat layer for this guy in the foreground, and then we can just tweak little bits here. Some nice shapes in there. tiny little toe, and it's a tiny piece of otherwise much bigger image, but just want to get the shapes on this right from the get-go. I'll be laughing. And like I said before, even though it's something I guess is definitely, I am biased towards this because it's the way I like to work, but the shapes that are kind of being created here to me at the moment are still way more important than the interior stuff. Obviously we need to get things, you know, lit correctly and get our values correct and all that kind of stuff, but at this stage I'm much more concerned with the silhouettes, because they are the things that are going to be the first kind of read. Give this guy a little kind of bitten up here a little bit, and then just start to, I should have actually erased some of the lines before I mixed all this stuff down together, but that's all right. Live and learn, I guess. And then just, yeah, speaking of silhouettes, just kind of breaking the edges up on this guy to give him a bit of a fuzzy feeling. Probably do the same thing with the wings as well, because they are a membrane. This guy's probably been through a bit of stuff. Getting a little bit muddy in a few spots as well, so I'm just aware, I'm kind of staying conscious of that. A lot of that I think is to do with just a lot of the line work still coming through, but this is something that going forward I will make sure I fix. Just some kind of these not particularly nice greens coming through. Getting a little bit. A bit more red in there too will probably help. This one, still have the lines separate on this one, so this one I can actually be a bit smarter about and go in and erase the lines I don't want at all before I flatten it down, which is what I should have done on the other one. Especially on the edge of the wings here, which is just going to end in the membrane shape. We could probably get rid of a lot of that. Honestly, a lot of this stuff can probably actually go sooner rather than later, or at least get super raised down. And then we can just why that's going white, but it's interesting. I'll just do that. Yeah, I guess he's a pretty happy bat, Tom. Sorry, didn't see the chat there for a second.
We would be
Kind of happy, not too happy.
Join us.
Just have to be really careful not to get too caught up in the details here. I'm very good at that. And especially on this one at the back, which is really going to benefit from being left a little bit alone in terms of finish. We don't want to go too crazy with him because he is ultimately going to be kind of falling back into the distance a little bit. And now that I've got them, they're not done by any means, but I've got them kind of locked in. I'm going to shift back to some of the other areas of this image because I want to. I don't want to leave the rocks just as rocks. I want to add a little bit of detail to them. I want to add some foliage in there as well. So just starting to block that out and just really kind of like build the, I thought that would brush out a little bit more texture on it than it does. Just build up the environment a little bit more before we get, you know, too far into the painting, which is, and you know, because I'm introducing some new elements here, just like finding the palette on those things as well, just figuring out how I want to deal with that stuff. Yeah, so I want to have some kind of vegetation up here in between the buildings as well. I could use my clown pass to figure that out, but that's whatever. Maybe grab a. I want to keep everything. I want to keep all the shapes pretty stylized. I don't want to go. I don't really like foliage brushes as a general rule, but That's cool. A little bit of extra red in there. Just find a couple of brushes that kind of get the... Oops, that's the wrong file. Get the job done, and then we can go in and tweak everything to our heart's content later on. So just building up for the foliage, building up interesting shapes that can kind of sit around the composition. And I want this kind of this foliage to be kind of like sticking to the edges of the cliff, so it's kind of like these areas of very acrobatic shrubs and plants and things like that. And it's also a good way to just help strengthen the composition as well, because we can use these shapes as, you know, leading lines and things like that. So for instance, like I've done there, just like running, I'm not sure if it actually works perfectly well in that situation, but like running some of these shapes between things and behind things, just to show that they do kind of like emphasize the overlaps of the image. And then this one's a nice one here too, because the plant kind of turns the corner of the cliff face there, so it gets into a position where it starts to take on some light. It's a little bit too electric at the moment, but that's all right. It's another example of like having that kind of variation in color really helps. Just the depth of the painting, even though that first green that I put on was way too electric. Oops. If we paint over it, it does obviously settle down a bit, but some of that kind of fluoro green will stay visible, which just, you know, makes it it's a little bit more interesting to look at. I just realized I'm working underneath a screen layer there, which is that one, which is obviously making everything a little bit lighter, which is what I want, but it was screwing with my color picker. So just switching the color picker to, it was set to all layers. If you go into the color picker tool, you'll get this little menu at the top, and you can just set it to one of the other modes, which will allow me to basically skip that layer and just select from the actual layer I'm painting on. Did I use any 3D? Yes, I used a lot of 3D. The only thing that is not 3D in here at the moment are the two bats and the green bits. Everything else is 3D. So the original render, I think we still have here, is that. So you can see that this is a heavily 3D piece, and then, you know, the water has obviously been painted over a bit as well. But yeah, it's all relatively quick 3D. It's not anything too... Is that the right layer? Yeah, that's the right layer. Nothing too crazy, but it is definitely definitely receiving a lot of help in 3 dimensions. This was all done in Blender. but honestly, you could do this in any program. But Blender's the only one I know how to use, so Blender it is. Thank you. That is very kind of you. Hopefully it'll turn out all right. So just getting a bit of a, just trying to build a bit of a sense of the, you know, there's still light up here, even though this is a very unimportant part of the composition. Just, you know, always thinking about where the light's coming from and how to best kind of show that off. So obviously it's coming from the left, so just making sure that I'm building up a sense of that lighting in the background as these trees kind of tower up. There's a bit of a weird shadow on the top of that rock up there, and I don't know where that came from. Probably some weird bit of the 3D scene that I forgot to replace or something. I don't know. But I'm going to paint that out because I think it looks a bit weird. And honestly, while we're here, I'll probably just start bringing even more kind of hand-painted texture into these rocks, just by color picking and stuff that's already there, and just kind of working around and just continuing these kind of like horizontal patterns that are in the texture. So this is, I mean, it is painting, I guess, but it's kind of paint by numbers in a sense. All of this information is there. I'm just being conscious of trying to build up interesting silhouettes. And actually there's a brush that is really good for this kind of stuff. This one here is great because it changes its shape changes its rotation depending on how hard you press. So it's really good for like organic stuff. But as always with all of this stuff, the real trick, I think, actually let's turn dual brush off and turn the spacing down a bit. But yeah, the real trick I think for this stuff is to, you know, start big and just work down from there. So all of this stuff, just big kind of bold shapes, especially with rocks and organic things like this, where there's no limit. You can do whatever you want with the shapes in a rock. You don't want to be, the worst thing you can do is be boring with it. So just kind of working big shapes in there, and then, you know, tweaking as we go. I think the waterfall in the background especially, I want to make a little bit brighter. I have to be careful not to fight too much with the, could be using my selection layer for this, but I've already started. Don't want to fight too much with the buildings because they're obviously, I want them to be the brightest point in the image. But I mean, the good thing is that the waterfall and the buildings do kind of occupy the same space, so that won't be too much of an issue. But I don't want to, you know, bring too much of this. I mean, actually, the waterfall is technically, does have a brighter value in it at the moment, but it's got this layer in front of it, this fog layer, which is kind of knocking everything back a bit. But you can see as soon as I turn that off, not that one, this one, the brightness of the waterfall kind of starts to really flatten where that area of the image, because the values become very similar. So just by keeping the contrast on the buildings much higher, it allows me to just control where the viewer is looking for that stuff. And we'll get a bit of like, I guess, splashiness over the top of this rock feature. And then down the bottom of this image too, I'll probably at some point spend way too much time fiddling around with the shapes of all of the mist and the clouds and stuff like that. Anyone who works with me will attest to how much I whinge about clouds and the shape of them. And then essentially just in you know, like, not to be reductive about it, but like this just becomes an exercise in pushing details around and all that kind of stuff, and just focusing the detail on the area of the image that we want people to look at, you know. So it's not a particularly complicated painting. There's not a huge amount in it. It's a couple of buildings and some rocks and some plants. So just kind of like, it is like an editing process really at this point of just making sure that everything is as interesting as it can be, and then just tweaking lighting and all that kind of stuff. Just gonna add in a bit of a extra rock bit there. Oops. I'm just trying to remember if there was, we had them, yeah, we had some other bats in the distance as well, which we can add in probably a little bit later. It's not super important right now, but yeah, just making this waterfall. There's some weird geometry stuff going on there. I didn't really spend too much time making sure those waterfalls were particularly well built in 3D when I made them. And yeah, again, just lightening some of this stuff a little bit in the waterfalls, just to make them a bit more interesting. And obviously, as a waterfall goes over the edge of a cliff, that's like the area where you would expect to see the brightest kind of value, as the water really, you know, really breaks up and starts to reflect a little bit more. Which also works well because that's the area where we want to really push some of that. Oops. Foliage detail. So again, just like bringing in areas of detail in places where we want to kind of bring attention to the image, to that particular section of the image. So And I think part of like making an image that has been started with a 3D base look less 3D, it's mostly about just breaking up the silhouettes. And that's about it, as there's not too much else to it, unless you've gone real heavy with something. Maybe it's more of a, maybe that statement is more correct when you're talking about stylized stuff, but essentially just breaking up these silhouettes, making them look like they're not completely laser sharp and perfect. And that's really the thing that's going to help push the painterly kind of idea onto this image. But yeah, like I said, having hand-painted textures obviously helps a lot, because of that fact that it just introduces something kind of imperfect into the image from the get-go. You know, working on production pieces and stuff when deadlines are tight, there's some other kind of quick tricks you can use to help. If you've got a 3D base, kind of suck some of the computer lack of personality out of it. But for something like this, where I've got, you know, a little bit of extra, there's no deadline on this, I would like to get it, you know, done as soon as possible, obviously, but there's no real deadline on it. It's not something I need to use, but maybe we can add a little bit more interest to the waterfall situation here as well. We have like some, oh, actually let's make a new layer on top of the plants. But yeah, maybe just run like some other little waterfalls. Off the edge, stuff like that. Probably another little, on the subject of things that I see go wrong, sometimes with student work specifically, with this kind of process, is that, again, if you're picking up if you're adding something new to your workflow, you want to try and, as quickly as possible, stop that thing from dictating what you do in your work. Like, at the end of the day, you're the person calling the shots, right? So if you've built something in a certain way in 3D, you know, you have to remember that you always have the ability to change that if you decide that that is something that needs to happen. And I think, like, I see that quite a lot, where you can see that someone has gone in and done something because that's what the program has let them do, and they haven't necessarily moved beyond that. And you know, it's natural when you're first learning a new process, that will definitely happen, right? Like, you have to probably let it happen to an extent as well. But as you get more comfortable with it, you have to kind of go back to that thought process of, like, I'm the one in control here. So if this thing is not working, then I need to change it. And yeah, it's an easy little trap to fall into, that I don't think you want to, if it can be avoided. So that's, you know, just like tweaking shapes, like not necessarily going, oh, okay, well, this is the shape I made in 3D, therefore I have to keep it. You can always change it. I'm just gonna add some little balanced rocks up here on this ledge, because I think that's a fun detail, so why not? Just gonna flip this as well, just to make sure that it's compositionally working pretty well. It's a little bit open on the right still, but we can potentially just help that out a little bit just by bringing a bit more interest into the waterfall itself. So like maybe a little bit more, you know, maybe some lighter foam shapes coming down or something like that, just to break it up a bit. Or it could be some fog or something like that later on. You know, it could even be like another element in the very foreground. That's not something that was in the sketch, so I don't want to necessarily do that because I know the sketch works. Maybe even pushing a little bit of, I think I actually have a layer above that, don't I? Yes. Pushing a little bit of extra, because there is, maybe you wouldn't get like a rim light like that. That looks a bit weird. But we know the light's coming in from that direction, so maybe there's something we can push into there a bit further. Although actually what I probably need to do is just bring some of this foliage down behind, it's too light, down behind here. Have some little trees and stuff just snuck in on top of this ledge like that. Just a little bit less green in some of that foliage down there. Can bring up maybe a little bit more of the yellow and stuff into the areas that would be receiving a bit more of a highlight, but just looking at that before, it was a little bit too lime green. For my liking. And of course, we haven't actually touched the building yet. There's not, I obviously need to work on the top of the tower here, which is going to be just a matter of I think suggesting some kind of tiles up there. There's not a huge amount else I want to do to it, but in order to get some of that, this is going to be kind of way too close to be working, but just break up that silhouette a bit, because if there were tiles on it, if it was a shingled roof, it would have a bit of a bumpy silhouette to it. Obviously we're talking about something that's a long way away, so we don't want to overdo any of the detail here because it'll start to look kind of weird, but just kind of work into it there and then just bring some of that detail around. And just bring gonna bring a little bit more color back into the shadows there. Again, it's a tiny detail, but I feel like what was happening in the 3D was a little bit lackluster. just, you know, if there was these shingles kind of running down, there would probably be like a, just kind of light. This is slightly changing the values that we have in the painting, but just bringing a little bit of a lighter band highlight, I guess, just around the area of that cone shape where the brightest ones would be, and just extending into the shadows, just a little bit of a suggestion of the shadow that would sit underneath the tiles. But again, this is something where I'm relying more on suggestion rather than detail. We don't want to overdo it, so that will really kind of ruin the look of it, right? And it's, if this was a photographic kind of painting, well, I mean, if it was a photographic painting, I would have spent a lot more time in 3D. But that's, you know, it's a matter of knowing how far to push a detail. And even though, you know, it would probably be so small that you wouldn't see it, I'm just going to, along the dark edge there, just suggested a bit of a highlight on the edge of that lip. It's not super important, but it's a little detail. And then same thing with like the actual, we need to do a bit of painting over some of the really yucky stretched textures that have happened in here, which was just me being lazy when I was texturing. Again, this is more of a Photoshop editing job than a painting thing, but
We would be honored if you would join us.
and then it is actually pretty gross up here. It's an area where the denoising has kind of failed a bit, and I think also maybe the texture on that building just got a little bit weird up there. I maybe didn't check that as closely as I could have, so we might have to just do a little bit of painting up there as well, but more just simplification than anything. It does look a little bit weird from back. Like, I'm always going back to check the painting from like the way in which it would be viewed. So just making sure that it you know, I'm not working into tiny details that don't actually matter, because that's you don't want to be wasting time, right? But this area up here is getting a bit weird and muddy, so I'm just gonna paint out some of the speckly stuff. Hey Ethan, is that texture in the shadow of the building or a photo texture or a brush? All this stuff in here is actually like, that's actually what I'm talking about in terms of the denoising kind of failing a bit. When I rendered this, I didn't turn up the samples a huge amount, so that's actually just denoising and Blender going a bit funny. So like, and you can see it on this one here, like I haven't touched this at all at the moment, so this is at 100% out of the render. So yeah, there's a little bit of texture in the actual building texture that I rendered out, like it's not a flat color, but all of the kind of the muddy weird stuff that's happening up here is all just coming from the denoiser. It's not, in some places it's not really that bad, like it actually probably helps just add a bit of character to an otherwise fairly boring area. And what I'm gonna do with all of the, I guess like the brim here, or the underneath the gable of all these buildings, is just go in and add some kind of directional strokes to it, because that's just going to help make it look a little bit more, a little bit more painterly. Can be relatively quick with it, don't want to rush it too much, but Don't have to be super nutty about it. And again, just always coming back to here and just looking at it, just making sure that, you know, what I'm doing works for the level that I'm expecting people to look at this image in. And we're still going to, you know, we're going to still paint some more detail into the actual bats in the bat in the foreground here, the important one. The one in the background needs a little bit of cleanup work as well, but still going to put a bit of detail into that, which will help. Again, like, there's no point spending hours and hours up here painting in detail because I don't want anyone to ever look up there for too long. I want them to feed into the image as I want them to kind of look at it. So just coming back to the bat again. Oops. Cleaning up some of these edges. Here and there. Is that the right layer? That is the right layer. And yeah, it's just I think like one of the things that I have really liked about starting to use more 3D is the fact that it makes me, and I should do this anyway, but I tend to forget. It does make me kind of like plan my images out a little bit more, just because I find that the process, it just requires that. You know, like going into 3D requires me to think a little bit more about what I'm doing at any given point in time. Whereas if you just give me Photoshop, I tend to sometimes just get a bit carried away and you know, be a little bit too seat of the pants with stuff. 3D really, you know, you can't, I can't anyway. I can't do that because I end up just breaking stuff. And wasting huge amounts of time. So I know that if I go into an image with a little bit more of a plan, I know it'll work out a bit better, and so it actually ends up being a more streamlined process for me. Yes, this is Ned. Sorry, the titling of the video is broken. Even though I changed it on my end before I started, it still didn't. For whatever reason, it did not update the naming on Twitch or on, I guess, probably any of the other platforms that this is currently streaming on as well. So that's fun. But yeah, no, this is Ned, not Alex. So Alex's stream is always on the wait, what day is it? I don't even know what day it is. It's Thursday. Yeah. Alex's stream is on the Wednesday, and my stream is on Thursday. Hello. Yeah, you would have been a bit confused rocking up and seeing Alex painting in Photoshop. Maybe we can do something with this cave back here. I was going to just kind of avoid it, but maybe we can paint in. I was gonna do this in Blender as well, but I just couldn't make it work properly, and eventually just gave up to make it look right anyway. But just adding a little, like, inside the cave, maybe some just little, like, kind of little Swiss cheese kind of openings in the side of the rock. And this is potentially something we could add in. I don't want it to be a focal point of the image, but something we could add in to some of the rock that is not inside the cave as well. But just adding in some little weird little openings here on the side. Nice little details, perhaps. also just going to brighten up, because there is an edge. Oh, I'm the wrong layer. There is an edge kind of, no, not that one, 26 maybe? Yeah, this one. An edge in here where the rock does turn, and I think like this bit here would be receiving more light, and I want to emphasize that edge a bit more, so let's just paint into that a bit and just lighten up some of this rock before we get back to the better. Nice. I think just along the bottom here for this rock too, I'll just start to paint in maybe some more kind of defined cracks and details like that, just to push a bit more kind of contrast into that area as well. Oh dear. Just push the saturation there as well, and maybe just get some little clouds. I don't know if we can, well, we might be able to get away with white because we do have that layer there that's kind of pushing our values back a bit, so we could get a little bit of white in there, but I am going to also screen out a lot of that stuff and just kind of push it up in contrast a bit. Yeah, maybe over here we'll just start to, is that the right layer? No, it's not the right layer. That's the right layer. Just suggested some of those little Swiss cheese kind of holes in the rock. It's a nice little detail, just kind of pushes things a little bit in a more interesting direction. And maybe over here as well. just on top of here. I'm just going to start to just, I mean, they're going to be pretty much just little paint strokes anyway, but just get the those other little extra bats in there that we want to have, because they are a compositional thing, I guess. Well, I know. So we'll just go and kind of there. Nice little brush flicks in a sense. It's a bad one. And then have one coming out that does start to get, let's see, hit by the light a little bit more. Obviously not on the underside of its wings, but on the upper side it will get some nice light, and let's move it into a spot where that's a little bit more obvious. Don't want these things to be like super apparent, but just kind of standing out against everything else eventually. Also just realized that we're kind of getting into the anachronism of bats flying around during the day, which of course doesn't make any sense, but that's fine. Kind of has to be fine, because if it's not fine, I got to start this entire painting again, which I don't really want to do. So and then I'm also just going to paint in some, I mean, they're just going to be blobs, but of course the implication is that they are bats just relaxing up here under the ramp, and have some people, very small people wandering around on these little landing platforms. And often, I often think of these details as being kind of more for me rather than anything else. But I think, you know, if you put them in there, you're thinking about the right stuff, and it does tend to, I think, come across. And then just some other little architectural details here. So in this particular case, just some little indentations, insets around these doors, which we can just suggest out on the side that would cast a shadow. You know, we could do, if you wanted to get fancy with that, we could start to have some more intricate detail. This is all the kind of like last pass kind of stuff, even though I'm getting to it a little bit early, I guess. That is really helpful to just sell the image as being something that is, you know, complete and interesting and all that kind of stuff. Because something that I think is quite important when it comes to learning how to create, I guess, like, you know, a finished image. It's not so much about, I mean, obviously you have to learn, there's a skill set there to learn, right? Like how to paint things from a you know, from a theoretical point of view, and then also just learning how to use whatever software that you are choosing to use and figuring out how that works and all that kind of stuff. But then there's also, I guess, like I would call it a narrative point of view, where you have to, even though like a little architectural indent like that is not a narrative element, it's not really part of this important front-facing part of the story, but it's one of those things that if you leave that kind of stuff out, you'll often find that the images that you're making end up just, they look unfinished for some reason, and it's not because they don't have enough detail, because detail doesn't necessarily make something finished. In terms of like, you know, how many you know, not being able to read someone's fingerprints from a kilometer away doesn't make an image unfinished, but there's if you're not adding in, it's like I guess like a believable fidelity of stuff, you know, like things are made up of, sounds really stupid when you say it out loud, but things are made up of other smaller things, and if you don't really suggest some of that real world fidelity, right, like the fact that, you know, a sidewalk has cracks in it, and, you know, a person's face has got creases and furrows in the skin, and, you know, a tree has, you know, the leaves, some of them are going to be fresh, some of them are going to be dying, some of them have fallen off, you know, all that kind of stuff, which is not, it's detail, but not in the way that you might think about it explicitly. If you don't add that stuff into your images, they can start to look a little bit, I guess, empty. Add some little ropes or something hanging off the building here. So starting to, I don't know, well, I kind of am, I guess, avoiding bits of that bat in the foreground. I'm kind of having more fun just painting some of the more mindless details. I do want to fill at least a portion of the foreground here with just kind of mist coming up from the waterfalls, just to kind of, I guess, explain a little bit without showing it all what's happening, you know, just outside the frame of the image, just so you know, the viewer gets an understanding of what this area is really like. So just bring this up a bit, and then I think also, just as a, let's see, I forget what I did with my layers back here, but this is all probably one layer. I'll just do this with a manual selection here. Just bringing in, what's that going to do? Perfect, that's exactly what I want to do. Just bringing in like a cloud as a graphical shape here, because I think that's going to be really good when that starts to push up above where the shadow's being cast into the light. We can use that as a really nice little that's too bright, but like a nice little kind of hit of light in there. Just kind of fun on the paper. Which also lets us kind of emphasize the some of the silhouettes in the foreground as well. Funkiness there. And then a little bit of the same. There's the wrong color. Same here and behind the waterfall there coming out of the cave. Just add some yeah, that kind of works nicely. Just kind of like sink that rock down into the haze there. Covering up some of those Swiss cheese holes, but that's fine. I think that's another thing to remember. It's really important with this type of image too, is like if you've got something, and or any painting really, like if you have an area that you can't be attached to it too much, you have to, if you find a better solution for something, and it means that something else that you had already done goes away, and you're a little bit sad about the fact that you have to now cover up something that you thought was really cool. Yeah, try not to get over attached to areas of paintings, because you know, at the end of the day, you just want the image to work. It's not about whether or not you accidentally drew a really good stick or something earlier on in a painting, and then you have to paint a cool leaf over the top of it because the image needs it. Like if it works, if it makes the image better, just doesn't matter what you might have to get rid of, just let it go. Just putting a little bit of these clouds are all kind of like down in the shadow, but just it's a bit of an artistic license again, but just a little bit of I guess like a halo, a silver lining on some of these clouds, just to push them out a bit in areas. And then I'm also going to use this smudge brush just to push the shapes around as well. And then we're gonna, I guess we're almost out of time here. We'll just come back to the bat for the last 10 minutes here and work on these guys. Not really gonna, I'm not gonna, like, I wasn't planning on finishing this today. Might do a little bit more work on this next week as well. We'll see how we go. I might finish this off just between streams. See how we go. Hadn't really quite figured out exactly what I wanted to do after this image for this project, so We will see, but yeah, just a little, adding a little bit of kind of a really kind of intense pop of color just on the end of his wings there. I think his eye needs to move up a bit and maybe get a little bit bigger actually. Yeah, that's much better. It's good. I suck at getting eyes in the right spot on creatures. Always have, probably always will. Rotate this foot a bit too, that's also a little bit, it's at a bit of a silly angle anyway, like I said, it makes him look a bit goofy, but I kind of like it, having that, some weird foreshortening on the leg I guess for sure, but I like the little effect that has. Makes him look a little bit sad, but I'm just gonna just ever so slightly tweak the shape of the eyes. And there, and this guy's got, I don't know how much this will actually show up, but he's got a little bit of a snaggletooth situation going on. I don't know if bats even, no, I guess they probably don't have whiskers, do they? Probably should have checked that. I don't know if it'd be kind of nice to give these guys whiskers, but it might look a bit weird. Looks like a giant mouse. If we do that, let's not do that. And then our little character up here, of course, that we haven't really dealt with yet, and is not going to need a huge amount of dealing with because he's tiny. In the original painting I did, this guy's got a little red cape that he's wearing, which maybe we keep that in, I'm not sure. I like it as a design idea, I don't know if it necessarily fits this image. That needs to go behind. I mean, you're not going to be able to see much of it anyway. But in the original painting I did with these characters, it was a really good little color pop kind of thing. Just kind of red, looks red nicely. But I don't know if it's not really, we're not in a position where that becomes super necessary for this shot. But it's there, I guess, if anyone wants to. Yeah, like in terms of other extra things that we can add in here, well, again, clouds being one of my favorite things, are always a really nice little indicator of depth as well. So for instance, if we whack a little cloud behind this bat right here, we can start to, I don't know if that's going to be the best place to put that cloud, but we can start to use that as a bit of a indicator of depth, just sort of a reminder of depth, I guess. The rest is there. I like to just have a few, especially like in a shot like this where it does make sense to have some kind of like mist and stuff hanging around in the background. Just every single like cloud or bit of rock, rock sticking out, or the foliage or whatever it might be, it's all going to be an overlap because it all has to go in front of something and behind something else. And the more you can add overlaps to images and overlaps to paintings, the stronger they're going to be. It's super, super, super important. So yeah, just getting that kind of stuff in there, that kind of I'm actually just wondering if having maybe just a little bit of some lighter shapes just here in the foreground will be more beneficial. And yeah, like there's still a few little detail bits in here. I'd probably just want to spend like, I don't know, another hour or so on this piece. This is the screen layer that I was talking about, because I do want to just kind of knock the background back a bit. That actually might look better as a linear dodge layer that's super light, and then probably I would put another screen layer over the top of that, fill that with black, and then come back with probably a little bit of like a sun-colored yellow, just to punch in a little bit, almost like a bloom effect, I guess, or like an overexposure, because we are kind of down in the shadows here with this image, kind of exposing the shadows. So to make this look a little bit filmic, I would lean a little bit on that kind of idea that if you wanted to bring the shadows out in a shot like this, which was so low key or so kind of, I guess, occluded from the light, that you would have to kind of overexpose the highlights a little bit, and you'd get a bit of clipping. And the other thing I would do with a shot like this too, which is working into the shadows a lot, is could do this with a could do this with a multiple layer as well. Oops, wrong way. Just because I want to bring the blues out anyway. So this is more of a color grading step, I guess, more than anything. This is just using a curves layer here in the various color channels, and then just in the which is just darkening everything down a bit, and then in the areas that are kind of a bit more in the highlights and a little bit more kind of hit by that light, just bringing some of that warmth back in a little bit. So this is a step that I would usually do right in the end, but I think because we are basically on our time limit here, and I do still want to put a little bit more detail into this later, you can actually do this adjustment stuff now and then kind of work back underneath it, because it's all basically just adjustment layers, so there's nothing too crazy in there. And then probably, you know, there would be just a little bit of either sharpening or doing like a custom high pass like this. And then just applying that as a soft light can kind of gives you a little bit of extra pop. So it's a very similar kind of thing to an unsharp mask kind of filter. You can kind of see, if you turn it up like that, you kind of see the effect that it gives, which is a little bit of a halo. Obviously we're not going to do anything that extreme, but yeah, just a couple of little things in there, maybe a little bit of film grain or something like that, just to again just push the filmic quality of this. But so yeah, probably just a little bit of a sharpen, and then just masking that out and bringing it back on the bat, on the focal points, right? The main kind of points of the image that you want to stick out. That bat at the back probably still needs a little bit of work as well, but that's all right. You know, point of the building in there, all that kind of stuff. So. Yeah, like, I mean, we'll leave it there for today. And then I guess, like, yeah, here's that original sketch. I think like the sketch was always probably a little bit too dark or lacking in contrast, but I think I'm pretty happy with kind of like the sense of atmosphere and the sense of light I was going for between those two. So, you know, like I said, a few little compositional changes between the thumbnail and this. You know, we could have been much more, I guess, like exacting in 3D. It's probably a fact of me rushing on stream a little bit. But yeah, I think like I'm pretty happy with the sense of lighting, the sense of movement, you know, and the sense of kind of, I like the sense of whimsy that's come about in this as well, even though the kind of that was not really in the sketch. But I think like this kind of sits pretty nicely with what we had before. I'm just trying to see if I can, let's grab that. I think it's this one, the original one. Yeah, so just kind of grabbing, oopsie daisy, that's the wrong one. So now we've kind of got these two images now that kind of sit within the same world as each other, which is part of the part of the project here. The part of the point of this is to not just do a couple of nice paintings, but also just build a little bit of a world as well, and give you guys a bit of an insight into the type of visual development that I would put into kind of working a little project like this up. So yeah, I think like we'll probably have to, I'll have to think of exactly what I want to do for next week with this one. Still working into this world. I think we'll probably just keep working on this for the next couple of weeks. I do have another project. I think I mentioned this on an earlier stream, that I had some files for that I thought I had lost, and I recently found, which kind of made me pretty happy and made me also want to get back into that project. I kind of shelved it a bit because I was a bit annoyed thinking that I had lost some stuff. I thought it was on a hard drive that I'd packed up into a box, but I actually found them floating around. So I kind of want to work on that too. Always extra things. But yeah, we'll probably leave that there for now today. And yeah, we'll come back next week, same time. Hopefully we've figured out how to name these streams properly, so people don't think I'm Alex, and when Alex is streaming, they don't think that he's me. And yeah, we'll kind of keep cracking on to this. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. And yeah, I will see you all next week.